Welcome to this explainer. Okay, I want you to picture the ultimate high-stress crisis. You've got this massive, completely uncrossable sea stretching out right in front of you, and closing in rapidly from behind, an advancing, deeply hostile army. You are literally completely boxed in. No way out. Now, this is the exact scenario presented in the ancient biblical text of the Exodus. You know, the famous story of the Israelites trapped at the Red Sea. But today, we're not just looking at this as some historical or religious narrative. We're actually going to look at it as a profound masterclass in crisis management.
So think about your own life for just a second. What do you do when you are completely trapped? When you face those seemingly insurmountable challenges? When the walls are closing in and there's just a total lack of clear options? What's your default reaction? Do you freeze up? Do you panic? Do you immediately start frantically Googling solutions at 3 in the morning? We all have our own Red Sea moments, right? And the way we handle that initial shock often dictates whether we sink or swim.
Okay, let's dive into this, because here is where the plot really thickens. In Exodus chapter 14, we see two instructions given just moments apart. First, in verse 13, Moses tells the terrified people to stand still. But then, literally just 2 verses later in verse 15, God commands them to move forward. I mean, these two commands seem directly at odds with each other, don't they? It's one of the most famous paradoxes in biblical narrative. Is this just a case of leadership misdirection? Are they supposed to halt all action and wait for deliverance? Or are they supposed to start marching? Well, scholars and theologians argue that this isn't a contradiction at all, but rather a really profound sequential lesson. To understand how this works, we need to break down the very first part of this sequence, Command 1, which is to stand still.
Now, when Moses says stand still, we absolutely have to remember the context here. The Israelites are in a state of sheer terror. They're crying out, they're regretting ever leaving Egypt, and they are spiraling into total despair. So, stand still is absolutely not a command for lifelong passivity. It means stop the frantic self-rescue and silence the panic. It's an internal mandate. It's an instruction to silence the noise in your own head and just ground yourself. Because, let's be honest, you cannot navigate a crisis when you're hyperventilating.
And this builds into a much broader psychological picture. You must master fear to gain mental and spiritual clarity. Stabilizing your emotional state is a fundamental prerequisite for making any wise move whatsoever. Why? Because panic almost always leads to desperate, destructive decisions. In the story, the Israelites' panic was making them want to just surrender and go right back into slavery. Taking a moment to literally stand still forces a necessary pause. It makes you recognize that the situation might be bigger than what human effort alone can solve in that exact split second. It's all about securing your mind before you move your body. But of course, you can't just stay on the shoreline forever, right? That brings us to phase 2, Command 2, which is to move forward. Because once the panic is silenced, waiting can very easily degrade into total paralysis. Now, what's really interesting about this concept of stepping onto the water is that faith requires momentum. The text implies that God didn't just part the Red Sea while the Israelites were sitting in their tents, debating their options, or analyzing the wind patterns. No, the miracle happened as they began to move toward the water. Standing still prepared their minds, but moving forward required their feet. They actually had to physically step out into the unknown. This introduces a fascinating theological and practical concept known as co-agency. Basically, co-agency is divine deliverance operating in tandem with human action. You don't just passively wait for a path to magically open up before you do anything. Deliverance frequently requires commanded, risk-taking obedience. Sometimes the path opens precisely because you took that first, terrifying step forward. It requires your active cooperation. So how do we actually reconcile these two commands? Let's look at the balanced approach. Navigating a crisis isn't an either-or choice between doing absolutely nothing and doing everything. It's actually a highly specific, sequential process. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how this works in practice. So in phase 1, the command to stand still looks like an internal pause. You stop panicking, you stop trying to force a bad fix out of sheer desperation, and you look at the situation objectively. You ground yourself. Then and only then do you enter phase 2, move forward. This is the external action. You take the next logical step with the light you currently have, even if the final destination isn't perfectly clear. You apply for the job, you have the hard conversation, you make the difficult choice, trusting that clarity is going to come as you move. Now, this ancient framework isn't just for historical analysis. Let's talk about navigating modern crisis.
When you face your own Red Sea today, how do you actually apply this exact sequence to your life? The sources offer several incredibly practical steps for finding direction when you're in turmoil. First up, pray for clarity and peace. And honestly, allow that peace to be the ultimate lie detector test for any action you want to take. If you don't have peace about it, you probably shouldn't move yet. Second, seek scripture and wise counsel to compare your options with established principles. Third, be willing to take small, obedient steps when the leading becomes clear. Don't wait indefinitely for a dramatic miracle, but don't plunge ahead on impulse either. And finally, remember your community. Consult trusted mentors and believers who can either confirm or challenge your sense of direction.
But as you go through these steps, there is a super crucial distinction to make: exploratory discernment versus frantic busy work. Yes, you absolutely should explore your options, but from a position of stillness, not panic. Exploratory discernment means you're calmly gathering necessary information and preparing. Frantic busy work, that's when you substitute constant nervous activity for actually seeking real direction. You're just throwing things at the wall in a frenzy, hoping something sticks. Once a calm direction aligns with wisdom, then you transition to moving forward.
There's also a really vital dynamic here regarding leadership. Sometimes the leader's call to act differs completely from the community's call to trust. Timing and authority really matter. Leaders might be told to take that terrifying step out into the water to initiate the action, while the community is still being called to stand still and trust the process. Discerning your specific role in a crisis, whether you're the one who needs to step out first or the one who needs to hold the line, is incredibly important. So the crucial point here is brilliantly summarized in this quote: "Waiting on God is an active posture, not a passive one." This is the ultimate bottom line of the Red Sea paradox. You do not treat "stand still" and "move forward" as a multiple-choice question where you only get to pick one. You quiet your mind so you can accurately hear the direction, and then you move your feet when the command comes. Quieting the mind is exactly what prepares you to move. Which leaves us with the ultimate question for you to consider today. Now that you understand the sequence, that vital internal pause followed by the necessary external momentum, what is your next terrifying first step forward? Think about the Red Sea you are facing right now in your own life. Have you actually silenced the panic? Have you gathered your clarity objectively? Because if you have, the water is waiting for you to step into it. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep stepping forward, and I'll catch you next time as we continue to break down the world's most fascinating concepts.